Good day. The news today is dominated by two events: the mobilization, the partial mobilization, which is underway in Russia, and the referendums which are underway in the Russian-controlled regions of Ukraine. Now, what is going on with this partial mobilization and with the referendums depends very much on the perspective you have and what parts of the media you read. If you go to the Russian media, the mobilization is proceeding according to some sort of well-oiled machine. There's lots of pictures and photographs and films of long disciplined queues of ex-military people lining up at draft boards, waiting to be brought back into the military. And one also gets reports of all sorts of members of the Duma, the Russian parliament, who are volunteering for themselves to be sent to join the military and to be sent to the front lines. Overwhelmingly, the impression which is given is of support across the country and across all demographics for this partial mobilization. Russian media is also full of film and pictures of disciplined and happy queues of people going to vote in the referendums in the Russian-controlled regions of Ukraine, and with lots of comments and discussions and debates about the number of people who are going to vote to join Russia and the percentage of those who will vote to join Russia, with most assuming that in the Donbass, at any rate, it'll be around 90% of those who vote. Well, if you go to the Western media, it's a completely different story. There you get pictures and films of airports in Russia filled with people trying to flee the country in order to avoid conscription. You get reports, including from the British Ministry of Defence and from other agencies like the Institute for the Study of War, of how the Russians are going to break their own arrangements and are going to just drag people into the army from every conceivable place because, well, there's huge unwillingness and reluctance to serve. And of course, the referendums in Ukraine, or what is still technically Ukraine, even by Russian admission, they will, and apart from the Donbass republics, which of course Russia considers independent, well, these are being dismissed as complete and utter shams. Now, here I am in London. I'm not either in Russia or in Donbass or in Kherson region or in Zaporozhye or in any of these places which are voting or where mobilization is taking place. For me to be able to say conclusively which of these views is true and which is false is impossible. And I think that I have to say that right from the outset. But nonetheless, I think one can approach this issue with a certain amount of logic and drawing to it one's own experience. And there's a number of things that I think one can quickly say. Firstly, I cannot imagine that the Russian military has not got very carefully prepared plans for mobilization. And the sort of people they're going to want to enlist in the military are going to be people who will have served in the military relatively recently and who therefore will not require excessive amounts of training. I would have thought this was obvious. I can't imagine that it could conceivably be otherwise. I am sure, as I said, that most of the people who are going to be brought into the army at this time are people who have served in the army and who are known to the military and who are probably in their mid to late 20s or perhaps early 30s. There might be a few technical specialists and officers who are a bit older than that, But I doubt that there will be many of those, and such as they are, I suspect they will come from the very senior ranks. So I would have thought this was a fairly structured mobilization. And I'm going to also suggest that the sort of people who are being called up are the kind of people who are probably fairly close to the military anyway, who consider themselves reservists, who probably go in for reserve training. Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, mentioned this, periodic reserve training, who are probably, not especially averse to joining the military, either because they passionately believe in the cause, and we should not be cynical, there are many Russians who do, but also because, straightforwardly, this is something that they signed up for when they joined the military in the first place, and they've always presumably retained their connection and attachment to the military ever since. Now, I'm not an expert on the US military system, or indeed the British military system, come to that, but I know that both the US and British militaries have reserves. In Britain, it takes the form of the Territorial Army. In the United States, it's the National Guard and other organisations. And I can distinctly remember that when the United States and Britain has deployed troops in all sorts of places around the world, Iraq, Afghanistan, wherever, they have had to call up reservists in order to fill up the gaps, the numbers. And I've never remembered this being particularly controversial. This is not the same as conscription, where people who have never served in the military or who are only or who are joining the military as conscripts are then being sent off to fight in all sorts of places which they might be unhappy about. This is something, it seems to me, quite different, and obviously there will be some people who have become accustomed to civilian life, who have developed civilian careers, who probably will not be happy to be called up in this way. I think that they are relatively few. And I suspect that we're going to see this mobilisation proceed, as it appears to be doing, in a fairly quiet and efficient way. As I said in my previous video, it is simply a misconception that the Russians have not tapped on their reserves before when engaging in military operations. They did so during the intervention in Czechoslovakia in 1968. They did that during the intervention in Afghanistan, by the way, in 1979, when again reservists were conscripted into the divisions in Central Asia, which launched the immediate strike on Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, in 1979. And they've done it during the Chechen wars, and no doubt they will continue to do it in the future as the need arises. Likewise, I doubt that this is going to create ultimately a huge stir in Russian society. It's big news for the moment, of course. I don't think it's going to have any significant impact on the economy, and I don't think it's going to change the everyday pattern of ordinary life. Well, if I'm wrong about the National Guard being called up or the Territorial Army being called up, people who have more experience in the militaries of the United States and Britain can comment about this to me. But anyway, that's my recollection of events in the past in America's and Britain's wars, and I don't see why this should be especially different. Now, what about the referendum? Here I'm going to say that I suspect that there may be differences in particular regions. In Donbass, in Donetsk and Lugansk, every indication that I have seen, every expression of sentiment that I have seen, including, by the way, some from Western journalists, suggests overwhelming support for union with Russia. Moreover, I expect that the Donbass, when it unites with Russia, like Crimea, will very rapidly recalibrate itself and will drop whatever lingering Ukrainian identity it might once have. Its people will rapidly reconsider themselves, redefine themselves as Russians. They are, after all, Russian Orthodox, Russian speaking, Eastern Slavs. They're no different in any respect from the Russians of Russia. And I think that they will, as I said, very rapidly start to conceive of themselves and to think of themselves as Russians. I'm not quite so sure about the situation in Kherson region and Zaporozhye. I think that probably most people in this area probably do still feel themselves Russian, or at least feel some affinity to Russia, and quite possibly the events of the last 7 months of the war have solidified that feeling. Right at the start of the war, when Russian troops first moved into these territories, to places like Melitopol and Kherson, there were all kinds of pictures which appeared in the Western media of protests against the Russian occupiers. Protests didn't look to me to be very big, and after a certain point, they melted away. Having said that, I also accept that there's a likelihood that there is a lingering, or at least a real, pro-Ukrainian sentiment in these regions. I'm not going to try and guess the statistics. What I will say is that even if this pro-Ukrainian sentiment exists, no one should be under any doubt that it's going to find about it finding expression in this referendum. Now, I don't want to sound cynical or worldly, but the Russians would not be allowing a referendum like this to take place in places like Kherson region or Zaporozhye unless they were absolutely sure what the outcome was going to be. And that means that if there are people who want to come out and vote in Kherson region and in Zaporozhye to stick with Ukraine, they might find that their vote has less significance than it perhaps should do. Now, I'm not going to put it more strongly than this. I don't think one should be naive about these matters. To be straightforward about this, the Russians control the situation on the ground in Kherson and Zaporozhye, and that means that they're able to control the outcome of referendums like this. It may not be democracy, pure and unadulterated, but it is the reality. Now, what does that mean in the long term? Very little, in my opinion. Even if people in Kherson region and Zaporozhye overwhelmingly wanted to stick with Ukraine, the fact of the matter is, once these referendums are over, once these regions are joined to the Russian Federation, they will become a part of the Russian Federation. Given that, in my opinion, it is most unlikely that they do overwhelmingly want to join, to remain with Ukraine, I think on balance, probably a majority would prefer to become a part of Russia. Well, that makes the absorption of these regions into the Russian Federation even easier. If there had been real opposition to Russia in Zaporozhye region and in Kherson region, then we would certainly have seen, or so it seems to me, in conditions of war, something like a resistance movement or a partisan movement or something of that kind, or at least some kind of political opposition movement emerge in these regions. All the indications are that the population of Kherson and Zaporozhye are either mildly pro-Russian or perhaps essentially passive and indifferent to who ultimately wins this war. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say about the referendum. In Donbass, I've no doubt union with Russia has overwhelming support. In Kherson and Zaporozhye, probably majority support, probably less overwhelming, certainly less overwhelming than in Donbass, but ultimately these territories are going to be joined to Russia and are going to be absorbed in Russia. And I think that is now a given. So, we looked at the mobilization, we've looked at the referendums. What about the situation on the battlefields? There's been very little information about the information from the battlefields over the last couple of hours. Yesterday, I discussed in my program how it appeared that a bridge linking eastern Bakhmut city with the center had been destroyed by the Ukrainian forces, indicating that they're about to pull out of and abandon eastern Bakhmut city. I wasn't entirely sure when I made that program whether that really was the case. I'm not entirely, don't entirely trust the reliability of the pro-Russian Telegram channel that published the pictures of this destroyed bridge. It has since been confirmed. Now, to my mind, what this points to is the fact that the battle for Bakhmut city is now drawing to an end. The Wagner group and the other forces that are located, the pro-Russian forces located in and around Bakhmut, are now either in the center of Bakhmut or very close to being so. And it seems to me only a question of time before this important city, this supposed linchpin of Ukrainian defenses in Donbass, finally falls under Russian control. Now, Ukraine has been trying to counter by launching an offensive in northern Donetsk region. And the focal point of this offensive is the Russian-controlled town of Krasny Liman. There's been attempts by Ukraine to capture Krasny Liman, which have been going on for roughly 2 weeks, ever since Ukraine was able to roll into the Russian-controlled areas of Kharkiv region and occupy those after the Russian troops basically withdrew from that area of Kharkiv region. And there's been intense fighting in and around Krasny Liman, and there was another major attempt made by Ukraine to capture Krasny Liman yesterday. However, it failed, and apparently all of these attempts by Ukraine to capture Krasny Liman have been beaten back up to this point with heavy losses. Now, one Russian commentator has claimed that Ukraine has lost more troops in trying to capture Krasny Liman than it lost in the offensive that captured Balaklia and Izium 2-3 weeks ago. Whether that is true or not, I have absolutely no idea. What I would say is that the Ukrainian force that has been deployed to try to capture Krasny Liman does seem to me to be significantly smaller than the one that was launched and which conducted that counteroffensive in Kharkiv region. The Kharkiv counteroffensive, despite some wild claims that I've seen it's about the number of Ukrainian troops and units involved, it seems to be growing with almost every single account, but that counteroffensive was actually conducted by a force of roughly 3 brigades, roughly 9,000 men. As I understand it, this attack on Krasny Liman, this offensive or attempted offensive in northern Donetsk, is the work of 2 brigades. Moreover, these 2 brigades seem to be at somewhat lower strength than the brigades that were launched against Kharkiv, the Kharkiv region, Izium and Balaklia. So if we say, roughly, that 9,000 Ukrainian troops undertook the offensive against Balaklia and Izium, perhaps 5,000 Ukrainian troops are trying to conduct this offensive against Krasny Liman. Now, the Russians claim that 2,000 Ukrainian troops were killed over the course of the offensive in Kharkiv region. If more than 2,000 troops, Ukrainian troops, have been killed in the fighting around Krasny Liman, then that is 2,000 Ukrainian troops out of a total attacking force of roughly 5,000, let's say 6. I cannot believe that figure. It seems to me that must be an overstatement, an exaggeration. I suspect that the true number must be lower than this. I just make that observation. I don't want to push it too far. Maybe there are more Ukrainian troops involved in the attack on Krasny Liman than I know about. Maybe Ukrainian losses in the Balaklia Izium counteroffensive were less than 2,000, the 2,000 killed that the Russians say. Who knows? But one way or the other, I find that claim by that particular Russian commentator to be difficult to accept. Anyway, elsewhere on the battlefields, so far it's all been reasonably quiet. And I come back to the point that I made in yesterday's program, that time is now starting to shift against Ukraine. Apparently not far off now from the autumn rains and the autumn mud. October is usually a time when this sort of thing apparently happens, and we're now in the last weeks of November, last week of November, so October isn't very far off. Apparently that will turn this area into mud, and supposedly if that happens, the kind of armoured vehicles that Ukraine uses are not really very well adapted to the autumn mud in this part of Ukraine, or indeed of this region. By the way, those of you who are interested in World War II history, and who probably read your World War II history, will know that the Germans in 1941 were slowed down significantly by the effect of the autumn mud, and also the autumn and spring muds. The autumn mud caused by the rains, the spring mud caused by the thaw, are indeed well-known factors in influencing the conduct of military operations in this region. The Russian and Soviet armies, which have had to operate, of course, in this region, have always designed their tracked vehicles so that they can, at least to a certain extent, deal with this kind of mud. But the increasing numbers of vehicles that Ukraine is using, which come from the West, apparently are not. Besides which, it is, I think, largely acknowledged by every side, including Ukraine, that Ukraine has suffered heavy losses as a result of these counteroffensives that it has launched over the course of September. Now, the Russians are given their numbers. Ukraine is given no numbers. Neither has the West on behalf of Ukraine. But there's no doubt at all that large numbers of troops have been killed, and large numbers of machines, of tracked vehicles, of tanks, of armoured personnel carriers, and all of the rest have been destroyed. And there's a very good indicator that this is now turning into a severe problem for Ukraine, because we've seen over the last few days Ukrainian officials, including President Zelensky himself, cranking up demands for the West to start supplying tanks, actual tanks to replace the tanks that Ukraine has lost. And they're now obviously talking increasingly about Western tanks. But it seems the militaries in the United States and Germany, the two countries which have the largest number of tanks in the West, or at least have the largest capacity to produce tanks in the West, seem very reluctant to supply Ukraine with US and German tanks, with Abrams tanks and Leopard 2 tanks. And I suspect the reason for this is multiple fold. Firstly, it would take a very long time for these tanks to be, for Ukrainian troops to be trained to use these tanks. It would probably take at least 6 months for them to be able to use these tanks in an effective way. Secondly, my sense is that these tanks, huge hulking machines weighing something like 70 tons apparently, are not particularly well adapted to this kind of topography, this kind of landscape. Russian tanks, which is the kind of tanks Ukraine has also been using, T-64s, T-72s, T-80s, T-90s, are much smaller, typically weigh around 50 tons, and so they're smaller and they're lighter. They're able to operate over soft ground. They apparently have the capacity to operate over longer distances without being prey to repeated mechanical breakdowns. Here I'm going to say something which I actually know, which is that if you have a vehicle that weighs 70 tons, its maintenance load, the time and effort you need to keep it in a condition of repair, is probably likely to be at least double that of a vehicle which weighs 50 tons. It becomes cumulative. The problems become cumulative because loads on from the weight on the various mechanical parts are such that the vehicle becomes more brittle and more subject to breakdowns, however strong it might in theory be. So Western tanks are going to need enormous amounts of maintenance, and I don't think that Ukraine is in a position to provide that kind of level of maintenance, and I doubt that these tanks can operate effectively in this kind of landscape. I don't think they're designed for it. They were originally designed for the fighting in the dense cities of Western Europe during the Cold War to counter a Soviet offensive that everybody was afraid might take place there. They can operate reasonably effectively in the Middle East, where again distances are small and climatic conditions are relatively benign. But I think that this landscape would be very challenging for them, just as, by the way, Afghanistan was. I would make an observation that the Soviets, in their intervention in Afghanistan in the 1980s, did deploy a large number of tanks to Afghanistan. Well, it was striking that the Americans and the British didn't. And again, I suspect that the reason for that is that their armour is just too heavy. So I think that's probably the primary reason, apart as well from the fact that, as I said, it would just take an inordinate amount of time to train up Ukrainian troops to that kind of level. The cost of re-equipping the Ukrainian army with Abrams and Leopard tanks is going to be simply huge. And as I said, to sustain it in battle would be enormously demanding and challenging in these conditions. I would add, by the way, that because it would be so challenging and demanding, it's quite possible that these sort of tanks would not do particularly well in the kind of encounter battles that we're increasingly seeing in Ukraine. And of course, the sight of Leopard 2s and Abrams tanks being knocked out by the Russians might not be ones that the US and German militaries and their respective arms companies particularly want the world to see. So, for the moment, there is resistance to providing these tanks, and I suspect that in this instance, they probably won't be provided. The very fact, however, that the Ukrainians are so insistent in demanding and requesting supply of these kind of tanks shows the heavy losses which they have suffered. Now, I said that they're probably not going to get Abrams and Leopard 2 tanks. It's conceivable that they might be eventually supplied by older Western tanks like the Leopard 1 and the French AMX 30, which are apparently still around in some quantities. I don't think these tanks are particularly well adapted to this landscape either, as it happens, and they are certainly inferior to the most advanced Russian tanks, the T-90s. But the word that I'm hearing at the moment is that rather than supply tracked vehicles, proper tanks in other words, the United States and its allies are now debating providing Ukraine with wheeled vehicles like the Italian Centauro and French vehicles of that nature. Well, I'm going to say straight away, I can see that those kind of vehicles might have some uses, but I certainly don't think they're up to a proper encounter battle with Russian infantry equipped with anti-tank weapons or with Russian tanks. So it would be giving Ukraine, again, weapon systems that Ukraine isn't really going to be able to use very effectively. Anyway, in summary, Ukraine was provided with large amounts of tanks from the West, ex-Soviet models, well adapted to its training system and its landscape, and also a large amount of infantry fighting vehicles and armoured personnel carriers, less well adapted to its military system and its landscape. The fact that Zelensky and his officials are now begging the West for tanks strongly suggest that that tank stock has been largely used up over the course of these counteroffensives. So where does that leave Ukraine? Well, autumn rains are probably coming. Doesn't look as if there's going to be any conclusive breakthrough over the next few weeks. Ukraine made a huge effort this September. It lost a lot of lives. It's lost probably the greater part, or at least a significant part, of its tank and armoured vehicle fleet. It no longer has a functioning air force that I can see, and it's facing a situation where the Russians have successfully parried its main offensives, inflicted heavy casualties upon it and are now going to be reinforcing in massive numbers. Now, the Russian Defense Ministry has said that Russia is looking to mobilize around 300,000 men. As I've said previously, it doesn't automatically follow that every one of these men is going to be sent to Ukraine. But even if some of these men are going to be kept in Russia so that other Russian units can be transferred to Ukraine, one way or another, we're going to see over the next few weeks and months a major build-up in Russian forces in and around Ukraine. If the full number of 300,000 is deployed, then for the first time in this war, the Russians will not only have overwhelming technological and industrial superiority over Ukraine, they will have numerical superiority also. Furthermore, it's important to say that though the autumn rains will presumably affect Ukraine's ability to conduct offensives, the same may not apply to the same extent to the Russians. We're talking about the main area of the battle, which is Donbass. Most of the fighting in Donbass is carried out by infantry, backed by artillery, in what are essentially urban or semi-urban or mixed urban and rural landscapes. It doesn't really matter whether the fields are a sea of mud if you're actually fighting inside places like Bakhmut city or beyond that Kramatorsk and ultimately Slavyansk. You can still advance there. The mud isn't going to affect you. So it's quite possible that even as the Ukrainian offensive finally grinds to a stop, this slow motion Russian offensive in Donbass will continue with the capture of places like Bakhmut, Soledar, perhaps Seversk, and then an ongoing attack on Kramatorsk and perhaps ultimately Slavyansk as well. So it's quite possible that the landscape of the war, the lines, will have changed by the end of the autumn and not to Ukraine's advantage. And of course, over and above and beyond that, the character of the war will have changed because, as I've discussed in previous videos, from a Russian perspective, it will no longer be a war in which Russia is coming to the help of the Donetsk republics. It will no longer be a special military operation. If Donbass, Kherson and Zaporozhye region, minus the city of Zaporozhye, are incorporated in Russia, then all of these are Russian territory, and the Russians will treat this as a war in which they're defending their own territory. So one can see that the situation is going to become, for Ukraine, very, very difficult at the end of the autumn as the winter approaches. It could find itself outnumbered, heavily outgunned, and controlling less of its territory than it does now. It could also find itself in a deep economic crisis at a time when its Western backers are potentially in an economic crisis. There's been a very, very fine article by the Canadian academic Paul Robinson, one of the most level-headed and sensible people discussing Russian affairs that I know about. And Paul Robinson has said that the effect of Western help to Ukraine has simply been to cause Russia to escalate, as all attempts by Russia, and indeed Ukraine, to negotiate a peace settlement on mutually acceptable terms have been set at naught. The result is that Ukraine may ultimately find itself in a worse position than it would have been in if that Western aid had never been provided. There's also been an article by Anatol Lieven in Responsible Statecraft. Anatol Lieven has shifted backwards and forwards on the question of the war, but even he is now coming round to the fact that these latest moves by Russia, the mobilization, the referendums in Donbass and in the other areas, or in the areas of Ukraine, in Zaporozhye and Kherson region, that these are game changers. And he too is now calling urgently for talks, a return to the terms Ukraine offered in March and which were rejected, or rather taken back by Ukraine at the urging of the West. Lieven makes the point correctly that the time window left to return to the 29th March proposals is now closing fast, with these referendums taking place and with this mobilization pending. He suggests that if peace is not sought on these terms now, the risk is, the danger is, that from a Russian point of view, it will no longer make any sense to seek that kind of peace on those kind of terms at all, because come late autumn, winter, the situation will have so completely changed. This is wise counsel, but contrast that with the comments that people like Secretary Blinken make. Now, there is at the present moment in time, it's the time of the United Nations General Assembly sessions. The Western powers have tried to turn the UN sessions into basically an anti-Russian, well, I was going to say a circus, but let's be more polite. Let's say that they've tried to use the General Assembly and a Security Council meeting in order to harass and hector the Russians over the war in Ukraine. The Russians haven't given an inch, and from what I can see, the various non-aligned countries, China, India, all of the rest, have once again retreated into their elaborate and very sophisticated and very well-reasoned and elegantly constructed circumlocutions, whereby they seem to give a little to each side, but are very, very careful not to come out openly and back either, something which the Russians are happy about, but with which the West is not. Anyway, over the course of these meetings in the United Nations, Secretary Blinken made this extraordinary comment. He said that if Russia stops the war, stops fighting, the war stops. If Ukraine stops fighting, Ukraine stops. It's one of those clever, or seemingly clever, actually facile, little phrases that Americans especially love. I'm going to say straight away, it is completely wrong. It could not be more wrong. If the war continues, it is if the war continues that Ukraine may stop. if you want to preserve Ukraine, you don't continue the war. You don't look to Russia simply stopping and demanding that Russia stops. You stop the war yourself, because that is the only way that a functioning Ukraine is guaranteed to survive. You know, short of a miracle, and of course miracles can happen, let's not say, I mean, you know, there's been instances in history when one side looked certain to lose and then something unexpected happened and things turned round. Famous example was in the 1760s when Frederick the Great of Prussia was almost on the verge of defeat, when his great enemy, the Empress Elizabeth of Russia, suddenly died. The miracle of the House of Brandenburg, as it is sometimes referred to. Well, miracles like that can happen, but statesmen should not put their faith in miracles. Much more likely, if this drags on and continues, if the war continues, that Ukraine will stop. If you want to save Ukraine, stop the war. Talk, engage, start some diplomacy, begin negotiations, bring the killing to an end. Accept, for example, that Ukraine has lost Donbass. See whether you might be able to find some kind of arrangement over Kherson region and Zaporozhye. I'm not sure why the Russians would want to agree to that, but perhaps, who knows, they might do. There might be pressures in Moscow and arguments and debates that we simply don't know about. But one way or the other, even if you have to accept that Kherson and Zaporozhye are also lost to Ukraine, if you stop the war now, you still have a functioning Ukraine. You might be able to keep for Ukraine Odessa, Nikolaev, Kharkiv, all of those places. So start those negotiations, end the war. General Shoigu, Defense Minister Shoigu, Sergei Shoigu, let's call him General Shoigu, he's a civilian. Let's just call him Defense Minister Shoigu, said that 61,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed and 39,000 have been wounded. Maybe these are untrue figures. They suspiciously round out to 100,000. But undoubtedly, thousands of people have died. Cities have been bombed. Infrastructure is being destroyed. And, of course, from the other side, things in Russia perhaps are not wonderful either. People are dying there too. Surely, this is the best moment, or rather, this is the last moment to agree a peace. I say that because it did seem to me that the Kharkiv counteroffensive, if it did anything, did open an opportunity for Ukraine to come and seek peace. Comments like those of Secretary Blinken suggest that that peace is not going to be found. The European Commission says that Russia's objective is to wipe Ukraine off the map. Well, that may be Russia's objective. It may be what Russia's objective is going to become. I emphatically do not believe it was Russia's objective at the start of the war. I think that the Russians at that time were looking for a diplomatic solution. Paul Robinson thinks the same. After all, if they were not looking for a diplomatic solution, why would they have sat down and negotiated with the Ukrainians throughout the whole of March? And why would they have welcomed the Ukrainian peace proposals which were made on the 29th of March? So, if you are going to insist on war, then the danger is that what the European Union is warning about, that Ukraine will be wiped as a country off the map, that may become a self-fulfilling prophecy. That will be a tragedy. When I say a tragedy, I mean people have multiple different views about Ukraine. I'm going to be straightforward. Before the 1980s, I never really considered it as anything other than a region of Russia. But I accept that Ukraine does have an identity, a personality, a right to nationhood, a right to statehood. I don't like to see states simply wiped off the map. But if that is what we're coming to, let it be clearly understood that Western policy is every bit as responsible for this as any other policy of any other of the players, be they in Kiev or in Moscow. I would say, in fact, that they are far more responsible. All the indications are that Kiev and Moscow could have come to some kind of a settlement which would have been maybe less than satisfactory to either, but acceptable to both, had it not been for the meddling, the constant meddling and interference of the Western powers. If this war does end in the way that the European Commission says, then European leaders and Western leaders, people like Secretary Blinken, will have a lot on their conscience. At that point, I'm going to end this video.